I thought I was living in a fairy tale marriage until I heard power tools running in my bedroom at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday. My name is Michelle, and for 15 years, I believed I had the perfect husband. Richard was the guy who remembered our anniversary, balanced our checkbook to the penny, and managed everything at home while I traveled for work. He was steady, reliable, the kind of man other wives envied me for having. But standing in my Connecticut driveway that October afternoon, 3 hours early from my business trip, everything I thought I knew was about to explode. The sound hit me the second I opened my front door. Bang, bang, bang. Someone was hammering upstairs in our master bedroom. My heart started racing because Richard's Honda wasn't in the driveway. So who is in my house? Hello. I called out, setting down my suitcase with shaking hands. The hammering stopped dead. I heard heavy footsteps moving across our bedroom floor, then urgent whispers. Multiple voices. Multiple people were in my home without my knowledge. I grabbed the aluminum baseball bat we kept by the front door, the one Richard always joked we'd never need in our safe suburban neighborhood. My hands were sweating as I gripped it and started climbing our carpeted stairs. Each step felt like it took forever. What if these were burglars? What if they had weapons? Should I call 911? But what if there was some reasonable explanation and I looked like an idiot? The whispers got louder as I reached the top of the stairs. I could make out at least 3 different male voices, and they sounded panicked. I took a deep breath and pushed open our bedroom door. 3 men in paint-stained work clothes were ripping up our hardwood floor. Our furniture was covered in plastic sheets, and there were chunks of our beautiful oak flooring stacked against the wall like firewood. The room looked like a construction zone. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady while gripping the bat. "I'm the homeowner. What are you doing in my house?" The oldest worker, wearing a faded baseball cap, stepped forward with his hands up. "Whoa, easy there. You must be Michelle. I'm Brandon Webb. Your husband hired us to replace this damaged flooring. Should be done by tomorrow." My husband hired them? When? Richard told me about every home repair, down to changing light bulbs. When did my husband hire you? Last week. Said there was water damage that needed immediate attention before it got worse. I looked around our bedroom carefully. The walls looked fine. The ceiling looked fine. I didn't see water stains anywhere. And those pieces of flooring they'd ripped up? They looked perfect to me. Where exactly was this water damage? The 3 workers exchanged glances. Brandon cleared his throat. Under the flooring. Your husband showed us where the pipe leaked. What pipe? More glances between them. The one from your bathroom. I'd been in our bathroom 20 minutes ago when I got home. Everything looked normal. The toilet, the sink, the shower, nothing looked like it had been leaking. Where is my husband right now? He went to get lunch for everyone. Should be back soon. Something felt very, very wrong. Richard always texted me about repairs, especially expensive ones. And why would he schedule major construction work for the exact time I was supposed to be out of town? What would you do in this situation? Would you trust your husband's explanation, or would your gut be screaming that something wasn't right? I asked the workers to take a break and went downstairs to call Richard. My hands were still shaking as I dialed his number. Straight to voicemail. That never happened with Richard. He always answered my calls. I tried again. Straight to voicemail again. While I waited, I started noticing other things that felt off. There was a pile of mail on our kitchen counter, something Richard never let happen. He filed everything immediately. But there it was, a stack of unopened envelopes, including what looked like insurance documents. Richard was the most organized person I knew. He color-coded our filing system. He set reminders for everything. He would never leave important mail lying around. An hour passed. Then I heard Richard's key in the front door. Michelle. His voice cracked when he saw me standing in the kitchen. You're home early. For the first time in 15 years of marriage, I saw something on my husband's face that made my blood run cold. Richard was terrified to see me. Your husband hired us last week for emergency water damage, the contractor had said, but I was staring at perfectly intact flooring that looked like it had been ripped up for no reason at all. Richard walked into our kitchen carrying bags of takeout food, and his hands were shaking. In 15 years, I had never seen my steady, reliable husband's hands shake. Richard, what's going on upstairs? Why are there workers in our bedroom? He set the food down on our counter with trembling fingers. There was an accident, Michelle. Last week while you were in Boston. A pipe burst in our bathroom and damaged the bedroom floor pretty badly. I stared at my husband. What pipe? I was just in our bathroom. Everything looks fine. It was a small leak behind the wall. I caught it early, but the water had already seeped under the flooring. Richard couldn't look me in the eyes. For 15 years, this man had looked me straight in the face when he talked to me. He was the most direct, honest person I knew. But right now, he was staring at his shoes like a guilty child. How much is this repair costing us? Don't worry about it. Insurance is covering everything. Insurance? We'd never filed an insurance claim in our entire marriage. Richard always said insurance was for major disasters, not small repairs. Since when do we file insurance claims for home repairs? Since the damage was extensive enough to qualify. His voice had that weird, tight quality it got when he was stressed about work deadlines. But here's the thing, I knew Richard's stress signals after 15 years. I knew when he was worried about a difficult client or a tight deadline. This wasn't work stress. This was the way Richard looked when he was lying to me. And that was impossible because Richard didn't lie to me. Ever. About anything. He told me when he ate the last piece of cake. He told me when he accidentally backed into our mailbox. He told me when he spent $50 on a new tool for his workshop. Richard didn't lie. It wasn't who he was. Can I see the insurance paperwork? It's complicated. The adjuster is handling everything directly with the contractor. The workers came downstairs and Brandon Webb approached us. We'll be back first thing tomorrow morning to finish the installation. Should have your bedroom back to normal by tomorrow night. How long has this project been planned? I asked Brandon directly, keeping my eyes on Richard. Your husband called us 2 weeks ago. Said he needed the work done while you were traveling so it wouldn't disrupt your schedule. 2 weeks ago? But I'd only decided to extend my Boston trip by 2 days last Wednesday. How did Richard know my travel schedule 2 weeks in advance when I didn't even know it myself? Richard's face was getting red. Michelle, you must be exhausted from traveling. Why don't you go rest and we can talk about this later? In 15 years, Richard had never dismissed me like that. Never told me I was too tired to have a conversation about our home. I'd like to see the damaged flooring. Brandon looked uncomfortable. Well, we already disposed of most of it. Had to get it out quickly because of potential mold issues. Mold? From a small leak behind the wall? That made no sense. After the workers left, Richard and I sat at our kitchen table with the Chinese food he'd bought. I watched him push lo mein around his plate without eating. This was a man who never missed a meal, who always finished everything on his plate. Richard, I need you to explain to me exactly what happened. Start from the beginning. He took a deep breath. Last Tuesday morning, I heard water dripping in the bathroom. When I investigated, I found a small leak behind the toilet. By the time I figured out how to shut off the water, it had soaked through the bathroom floor and under the bedroom flooring. Why didn't you call me immediately? You were in an important client meeting. I didn't want to bother you with something I could handle myself. Richard always called me about everything. When our refrigerator made a weird noise, he called me. When he couldn't find the warranty papers for our dishwasher, he called me. The idea that he wouldn't call about major water damage was completely out of character. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the conversation with the workers, Richard's obvious nervousness, and those insurance documents I'd seen on the counter. At 2 a.m., I got out of bed as quietly as possible. Richard was sleeping deeply, which was unusual for him. Normally, he was a light sleeper who woke up if I got a glass of water. I crept downstairs to look at that pile of mail on the kitchen counter. What I found there made my hands shake worse than they had when I was holding the baseball bat. There were insurance documents, all right, but they weren't for a small leak last Tuesday. The claim was filed 3 weeks ago for $12,000 for extensive water damage to our master bedroom. But 3 weeks ago, I wasn't in Boston. I was in Seattle. And Richard knew exactly where I was because he'd driven me to the airport himself. My husband hadn't just lied to me about when the leak happened. He'd filed an insurance claim before the leak supposedly occurred. How do you file an insurance claim for damage that hasn't happened yet? The answer to that question would destroy everything I thought I knew about the man I'd been married to for 15 years. What would you do if you found insurance paperwork that proved your spouse was lying to you about something this big? Would you confront them immediately, or would you dig deeper first? Because what I was about to discover would make this insurance fraud look like a parking ticket. A pipe burst behind the wall. Richard had stammered the night before, but I was looking at a man I'd never seen before in 15 years of marriage. My husband was lying to my face, and I could finally see it. I sat on our couch at 3 a.m., staring at insurance documents that made no sense. Richard had filed a claim 3 weeks ago for water damage that supposedly happened last Tuesday. The math didn't add up, and neither did anything else about this situation. But what scared me most wasn't the insurance fraud. It was realizing that I'd been living with a stranger. The man upstairs sleeping peacefully in our bed. The man I'd trusted with our finances, our home, our entire life, had looked me dead in the eye and lied about something major. And he'd done it so smoothly, so convincingly, that if I hadn't come home early, I never would have questioned anything. How long had Richard been lying to me? The next morning, I watched my husband make coffee like he did every single day for 15 years. Same routine, same careful measurements, same kiss on my forehead before handing me my mug. But now I was studying him like a detective. "How are you feeling about the bedroom situation?" I asked casually. Richard's hand froze for just a split second while stirring his coffee. "Fine. Should be finished today. Then everything can go back to normal." There it was again, that slight tremor in his voice. The way he wouldn't quite meet my eyes. How had I never noticed these things before? "Can you show me exactly where the leak happened?" "Michelle, the workers already fixed the pipe. There's nothing to see." "I'd still like to see where it was." Richard set down his coffee mug harder than necessary. "Why are you pushing this? The problem is solved. The insurance is handling everything. Can't we just move on?" In 15 years, Richard had never snapped at me like that. He was the patient one, the even-tempered one. When I got stressed about work or family drama, Richard was my calm, steady anchor. This defensive, irritated man sitting across from me? I didn't know him at all. "I'm not pushing anything. I just want to understand what happened in my own home while I was away." Richard's jaw tightened. "I already explained it to you. Multiple times. The workers arrived at 8 a.m. to finish the floor installation. I decided to ask Brandon Webb some questions while Richard was in the shower. "Brandon, when my husband first called you about this job, what exactly did he say?" Brandon looked uncomfortable. "He said there was emergency water damage that needed immediate attention. Said his wife was traveling and he wanted it fixed before she got home." "Did he mention where the water came from?" "A pipe leak," he said. "Showed us photos of the damage." "Photos?" Richard had taken photos of this supposed water damage? "Can I see those photos?" "Your husband has them. We just worked from what he showed us." When Richard came downstairs, I asked about the photos. "What photos?" "Brandon said you showed them photos of the water damage." Richard's face went completely blank. "Oh, those. I deleted them. Didn't want to keep pictures of our house damaged like that." Richard never deleted photos. Ever. Our phone storage was constantly full because Richard kept pictures of everything, every meal we cooked, every home improvement project, every random sunset. The man who had 47,000 photos on his phone suddenly deleted the only evidence of major damage to our house? That seems weird. You always keep photos of home repairs for our records. These were different. They were upsetting to look at. I watched Richard's face carefully. His left eye was twitching, something I'd only seen during the worst stress of his freelance career. His hands were fidgeting with his wedding ring, turning it around and around on his finger. After 15 years of marriage, I was seeing my husband's nervous tells for the first time, which meant I was seeing him lie for the first time. How many other times had he been nervous around me, and I just didn't notice? That afternoon, while Richard went to the bank to handle some paperwork, I decided to do some investigating of my own. I called our homeowner's insurance company directly. Hi, this is Michelle Patterson. I have some questions about a recent claim filed on our policy. Of course, Mrs. Patterson. I have your claim right here. Filed on September 28th for water damage to your master bedroom. The adjuster approved payment of $12,000. September 28th was 3 weeks ago, the day before I left for Seattle. Richard had filed this claim while I was home, probably while I was working in my office upstairs. Can you tell me what information was provided with the claim? Your husband submitted photos showing extensive water damage to the bedroom flooring, along with estimates from multiple contractors for repair and replacement. Multiple contractors? Brandon Webb had made it sound like Richard called him specifically. How many contractors had Richard been talking to about this fake water damage? Were there any red flags with this claim? The insurance representative paused. I probably shouldn't discuss the details of our investigation process, Mrs. Patterson. Investigation process? Is there some kind of problem with our claim? I'd recommend speaking with your husband about any concerns. He's been handling all communication with our office. After I hung up, I sat in our kitchen feeling sick to my stomach. The insurance company was investigating. Richard had been communicating with them without telling me. He'd submitted photos I'd never seen of damage that didn't exist. But why? Richard managed our money carefully. We had savings. If he needed $12,000 for some reason, why not just take it from our emergency fund? Why commit insurance fraud? What was Richard hiding that was worth risking felony charges? The answer was sitting in that pile of mail I'd been ignoring. I spread all the documents out on our dining room table and started reading everything carefully. Bank statements, credit card bills, investment account summaries, loan documents, and one envelope addressed to Richard that made my blood run cold. It was from a debt collection agency, for an account I'd never heard of, in the amount of $47,000. $47,000? We didn't owe anyone that kind of money. Richard showed me our finances every month. We were in good shape financially. We had minimal debt, excellent credit, and substantial savings. So what was this bill for $47,000? I opened it with shaking hands. The letter was demanding immediate payment for outstanding gambling debts owed to something called Atlantic Digital Gaming. Gambling debts? Richard didn't gamble. He'd never even bought a lottery ticket. He thought casinos were a waste of money and refused to go when his brother Scott invited us to Atlantic City. He lectured his clients about the importance of saving money instead of throwing it away on get-rich-quick schemes. My steady, reliable, responsible husband owed $47,000 in gambling debts to an online casino I'd never heard of. The room started spinning. I grabbed the edge of our dining room table to steady myself. How do you owe $47,000 to an online casino without your wife of 15 years knowing you gamble? The answer was about to get much, much worse. Because as I kept digging through those documents, I found bank statements for an account I didn't know existed. An account with Richard's name and my forged signature. An account that had received the $12,000 insurance payout 2 weeks ago. And an account that showed hundreds of transactions to online gambling websites going back over 2 years. Richard hadn't just lied to me about the water damage. He'd been living a completely secret financial life for 2 years while I praised him for being so responsible with our money. What would you do if you discovered your spouse had been gambling away thousands of dollars behind your back? And that's just what I'd found so far. because at 9:15 the next morning, two police detectives were going to ring our doorbell and tell me things about my husband that would make his gambling addiction look like the least of our problems. I found bank statements for an account that shouldn't exist, and our $45,000 savings account was completely empty. I sat at our dining room table surrounded by financial documents that painted a picture of a man I didn't recognize. The debt collection letter for $47,000 in gambling debts was just the beginning. The bank statements for Richard's secret account told a story that made me physically sick. For 2 years, 2 entire years, my husband had been making regular deposits into this hidden account. Money transferred from our joint savings, our checking account, and sources I couldn't identify. Then, like clockwork, that money disappeared into online gambling websites with names like Lucky Slots Paradise and Atlantic Digital Gaming. Hundreds of transactions. Some for $50, some for $5,000. All while Richard sat across from me every month, showing me our accurate financial spreadsheets and praising our excellent savings rate. But it got worse. I logged into our real joint savings account, the one I thought contained $45,000 for our future house renovations and retirement contributions. Balance, $247. $247. That was all that remained of 15 years of careful saving and responsible financial planning. My legs gave out. I slumped into our dining room chair, staring at the computer screen that showed our life savings had vanished while I was traveling for work, trusting Richard to manage our household finances. The insurance fraud suddenly made terrible sense. Richard hadn't filed that claim because he wanted to renovate our bedroom. He'd done it because he was desperate for quick money to pay gambling debts that were spiraling out of control. But how desperate was he? I kept reading through the documents with a growing sense of dread. Credit card statements for cards I'd never seen. All maxed out. All with minimum payments months behind. A second mortgage on our house that I thought we owned free and clear. Richard had borrowed $85,000 against our home equity without telling me. Loan documents from our bank. Richard had taken a $20,000 personal loan using our house as collateral. More debt collection letters. Not just from Atlantic Digital Gaming, but from multiple online casinos and lending companies. As I added up the numbers, I realized Richard owed over $200,000 to various creditors. We had maybe $15,000 in actual assets. Our house was mortgaged beyond its value, and Richard was still gambling money we didn't have. The most devastating discovery was a stack of documents showing Richard had been forging my signature for months. Loan applications with my name on them. Credit card applications I'd never filled out. Even a small business loan supposedly for Patterson Family Consulting, a business that didn't exist. My husband hadn't just been lying to me about his gambling addiction. He'd been stealing my identity to fund it. I found myself hyperventilating in our kitchen. This man I'd trusted completely, who I'd bragged about to friends for being so financially responsible, had systematically destroyed our entire financial life while maintaining the perfect facade of reliability. But the most chilling document was sitting at the bottom of the pile. A printed email conversation between Richard and someone named Tony about making payments on schedule or facing consequences. The tone was threatening, professional, and terrifying. Richard owed money to people who wrote emails about consequences for missed payments. I heard Richard's car in the driveway and quickly gathered all the documents. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely stack them properly. Richard walked into the kitchen whistling. Actually whistling, like he didn't have a care in the world. "Hey honey, how was your afternoon? The bedroom floors look amazing. You're going to love them." I stared at my husband. He looked exactly the same as he had every day for 15 years. Same receding hairline, same kind eyes, same gentle smile. But I was looking at a stranger who'd been systematically lying to me about every aspect of our financial life. "Richard, we need to talk." Something in my voice made his face change. The whistling stopped. The smile disappeared. What about? I pulled out the debt collection letter and set it on the counter between us. Richard's face went completely white. Where did you find that? In our mail pile. The pile you never file anymore because you're too stressed about hiding your gambling addiction from me. Richard sat down heavily in one of our kitchen chairs. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Michelle, I can explain. Explain how you owe $47,000 in gambling debts? Explain how our savings account is empty? Explain how you've been forging my signature on loan documents. His head snapped up. You looked at everything? Everything, Richard. The secret bank account. The second mortgage you took out on our house. The credit cards maxed out in both our names. The business loan for a company that doesn't exist. Richard buried his face in his hands. I was going to tell you. I was going to fix everything before you found out. Fix it how? By committing insurance fraud? By destroying our credit? By putting our house at risk? I had a system. I was winning more than I was losing for a while. I just needed one big win to pay everything back. I stared at my husband saying words I never thought I'd hear from him. Richard, who lectured his accounting clients about the importance of conservative financial planning, had been chasing gambling losses with more gambling for 2 years. Richard, we're financially ruined. Do you understand that? We owe more money than we have in assets. Our house is going to be foreclosed on. Our credit is destroyed. I know, but I have a plan. The insurance money will help, and I'm working on getting more clients for the business, and I think I can negotiate payment plans with the creditors. The insurance money from your fraudulent claim? Richard looked up at me with desperate eyes. It's not really fraud. We do need the money for home improvements. I just moved up the timeline a little. This was not the man I married. The Richard I married would never have rationalized felony insurance fraud as moving up the timeline. The Richard I married would have told me the moment we had any financial problems. I realized I didn't know this person at all, and I was about to find out exactly how dangerous that was. Richard, who is Tony? His face went completely pale again. What? The email about making payments on schedule or facing consequences. Who is Tony? Michelle, you don't understand. These people, they're not patient about late payments. What people, Richard? Before he could answer, the doorbell rang. I looked at the clock. 9:15 a.m. Who would be visiting us this early? Through our front window, I saw something that made my heart stop. A police car was sitting in our driveway. Richard saw it too, and the look on his face told me everything I needed to know. My husband's gambling addiction and insurance fraud were about to become the least of our problems. Mrs. Michelle Patterson? The voice came from our front porch. I opened the door to find 2 police officers, a detective in a suit and a uniformed officer with a badge that read Walsh. Yes, I'm Detective Terry Morrison, and this is Officer Anthony Walsh. We'd like to speak with you and your husband about an insurance fraud investigation. My knees nearly buckled. Insurance fraud? Ma'am, is your husband home? We have some questions about a claim filed on your homeowner's policy. Richard appeared behind me, and I heard him whisper something that made my blood freeze. Oh God. Brandon must have talked. The police weren't just here about insurance fraud. They were here because Richard's carefully constructed web of lies was about to collapse completely, and I was about to learn that everything I'd discovered was just the tip of the iceberg. What would you do if police officers showed up at your door to investigate crimes you didn't know your spouse had committed? Because what they were about to tell us would destroy any remaining faith I had in the man I'd been married to for 15 years. Mrs. Patterson, your husband's contractor has been arrested as part of a multi-county insurance fraud ring, and we need to ask you both some questions. Detective Morrison and Officer Walsh stood on our front porch looking like they had all day to wait for answers. Richard was frozen behind me, and I could feel him shaking. I'm sorry, what did you say about our contractor? Brandon Webb was arrested yesterday evening. He's been running fraudulent insurance claims with homeowners across 3 counties. Your husband's claim for water damage is one of the cases we're investigating. My world tilted sideways. Can we sit down somewhere to talk about this? We moved to our living room, where I'd had coffee with friends hundreds of times over the years. But sitting across from two police officers asking about felony charges felt like being on another planet. Detective Morrison pulled out a small notebook. Mr. Patterson, you filed an insurance claim on September 28th stating that a pipe burst caused extensive water damage to your master bedroom. Is that correct? Richard cleared his throat. Yes. And you hired Brandon Webb's crew to repair the damage? Yes. Here's the problem, Mr. Patterson. We've had Brandon Webb under investigation for 6 months. He's been helping homeowners file false insurance claims by staging fake damage and splitting the insurance payouts. He confessed to everything yesterday. I felt like I was watching this happen to someone else. Are you saying the water damage wasn't real? Officer Walsh answered. Ma'am, according to Mr. Webb's confession, there was never any water damage to your bedroom. Your husband contacted him specifically about filing a fraudulent claim. Richard's face was completely white. That's not exactly how it happened. Detective Morrison leaned forward. Then why don't you tell us exactly how it did happen? Richard looked at me with desperate eyes, then back at the detectives. There was going to be water damage. I mean, there were signs that our pipes might fail soon. I was being proactive. Proactive by filing an insurance claim for damage that hadn't occurred yet? I was trying to prevent a bigger problem. Detective Morrison made a note in his book. Mr. Patterson, we've reviewed the claim documentation. You submitted photographs of water damage, contractor estimates, and detailed descriptions of structural problems. Are you saying you fabricated all of that to prevent future damage? The room was completely silent. I could hear the clock ticking on our mantel, the same clock that had marked time through 15 years of what I thought was a happy, honest marriage. Mr. Patterson? We need an answer. Richard buried his face in his hands. I needed the money. For what? Richard didn't answer immediately. Detective Morrison waited, pen ready. Personal expenses. What kind of personal expenses require insurance fraud, Mr. Patterson? I watched my husband sit in our living room, surrounded by the life we'd built together, and realize he was about to confess to felony charges in front of police officers. I had some debts. What kind of debts? Richard glanced at me, then looked back at his hands. Gambling debts. Detective Morrison wrote that down. How much do you owe in gambling debts? Around $47,000. Officer Walsh raised his eyebrows. And you thought insurance fraud was the solution to that problem? I was desperate. These people don't give you a lot of time to pay. What people? Richard looked terrified. The people I owe money to. Detective Morrison's tone got more serious. Mr. Patterson, are you saying you committed insurance fraud because someone was threatening you to collect gambling debts? Not exactly threatening, but they made it clear that payment wasn't optional. I felt sick listening to Richard describe being in debt to people who don't take no for an answer. But I also felt furious that he'd put our entire family at risk without telling me. How long have you been gambling, Mr. Patterson? About 2 years. Detective Morrison looked at me. Mrs. Patterson, were you aware of your husband's gambling activities? No. I had no idea until yesterday. Were you aware of the insurance claim? No. Did you know about the home repairs being done this week? No. I came home early from a business trip and found the workers in our bedroom. That's how I found out about all of this. Officer Walsh made notes while Detective Morrison continued. Mr. Patterson, where did the $12,000 from the insurance payout go? Richard hesitated. Some of it went to pay gambling debts. Some of it. Most of it. All of it. Richard nodded miserably. So you committed insurance fraud, received $12,000 in fraudulent payments, and immediately gambled it away or used it to pay previous gambling debts? Yes. I stared at my husband. The insurance money was already gone. Not only had Richard committed felony fraud, but the money he'd risked our entire future for was already back in the hands of online casinos or loan sharks. Mrs. Patterson, Detective Morrison turned to me. We need to determine the extent of your involvement in this situation. My heart started racing. My involvement? I didn't know anything about this. You never signed any paperwork related to the insurance claim? No. You weren't involved in choosing the contractor or approving the work? I didn't even know the work was happening until I walked into my bedroom and found workers there. Detective Morrison made more notes. Mr. Patterson, did you forge your wife's signature on any documents related to this claim? Richard looked like he wanted to disappear. The insurance company required both our signatures on some forms. So you forged your wife's signature? Yes. Now I was involved whether I wanted to be or not. Richard had forged my signature on insurance fraud documents. My name was attached to felony charges I knew nothing about. Mr. Patterson, we're going to need you to come down to the station for further questioning. Mrs. Patterson, you should probably contact an attorney. An attorney? I needed an attorney because my husband had been living a secret life of gambling and fraud. Are you arresting him? Not at this time. But Mr. Patterson, you need to understand that insurance fraud is a serious felony. Combined with identity theft for forging your wife's signature, you're looking at significant jail time if convicted. After the officers left with Richard's promise to come to the station later that morning, I sat in our living room trying to process what had just happened. My husband of 15 years had committed multiple felonies. He'd forged my signature. He'd put our house at risk. He destroyed our financial future. And now I needed my own lawyer to protect myself from crimes committed in my name. But as devastating as that was, I was about to learn that Richard's gambling addiction and insurance fraud were just the beginning of his betrayal. Because Detective Morrison's question about forged signatures had opened a door I didn't want to walk through. If Richard had forged my signature on insurance documents, what other documents had he forged my name on? The answer to that question would show me that the man I married hadn't just hidden a gambling addiction from me. He'd been systematically stealing my identity for months to fund his secret life. And the people he owed money to were about to become my problem too. 2 years of online gambling, Richard had bet away our entire future while I praised him for being so responsible with our finances. After the police left with Richard for questioning, I sat in our empty house trying to understand how I'd been so completely fooled by someone I slept next to every night for 15 years. Richard returned 3 hours later looking like he'd aged 10 years. He walked into our kitchen, sat down at the table where we'd shared thousands of meals, and finally told me the truth about everything. It started small, he said without looking at me. Just $20 here, and they're on sports betting websites. I was stressed about the accounting business slowing down, and it felt like a harmless way to unwind. I sat across from him, listening to my husband describe becoming someone I didn't recognize. But then I started winning. Not a lot, but enough to make it feel like I had some control over our financial situation. When I won $50, I'd think about how that could help with groceries or gas money. Richard, we never needed help with groceries or gas money. Our finances were fine. That's the thing, they weren't as fine as I let you believe. I'd been struggling to get new clients for months. I was behind on some of our bills, but didn't want to worry you while you were dealing with stress at work. This was news to me. What bills? Small stuff at first. The electric bill 1 month, the mortgage payment another month. I kept thinking I'd catch up once I landed a big client. Richard had been hiding financial problems from me for months before he started gambling. Our perfect, organized household finances had been failing while I was traveling for work, completely unaware. So instead of telling me we were having money problems, you decided to gamble? It wasn't supposed to be gambling. It was supposed to be a solution. These websites make it look like you can win consistently if you're smart about it. They have systems and strategies and statistical analyses. I watched my husband, a professional accountant who managed other people's money for a living, described falling for the oldest scam in history, thinking you can beat the house. At first, I was winning more than I was losing. I'd put in $50 and come out with 70 or 80. It felt like I'd found a way to solve our problems without having to admit I was failing at supporting us. But you weren't failing at supporting us. We both work. We both contribute to our household. Why didn't you just talk to me? Richard finally looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before: shame. Deep, crushing shame that had been eating at him for years. Because you were succeeding. Your marketing business was growing. You were traveling to important client meetings. You were building this amazing career. And I was sitting at home struggling to find accounting clients and falling behind on basic bills. So you decided to fix it by gambling away our savings? I decided to fix it by winning enough money to get us back on track. But after a few months of small wins, I hit a losing streak. Lost $3,000 in 1 week. $3,000 that I never knew was missing from our accounts. That's when it stopped being about solving problems and started being about getting even. I kept thinking that one good night would win back everything I'd lost, plus enough extra to finally tell you the truth about our finances. This was the sickness talking. Richard was describing the exact thought pattern that destroys people's lives in casinos every day. But hearing it from my responsible, logical husband was terrifying. The online casinos make it so easy, Michelle. You can bet on anything: sports, cards, slots, even the weather. And they give you credit lines so you don't have to stop when your cash runs out. Credit lines. They basically loan you money to keep gambling. The interest rates are horrible, but when you're sure you're about to win big, it doesn't matter. Richard had been taking loans from gambling websites to fund more gambling. The kind of predatory lending that targets people when they're desperate and thinking irrationally. How much did you borrow from these places? Richard was quiet for a long time. Total? Including the website loans, the credit cards, the personal loans, and the second mortgage on the house. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Around $200,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. $200,000. More than our house was worth. More than we'd ever had in combined assets. Richard had managed to put us in debt for more money than most people make in 3 years. Richard, how is that even possible? How do you borrow $200,000 without me knowing? It happened gradually. A credit card here, a personal loan there. I kept thinking I'd win it back before you noticed. And I got good at managing the paperwork so you wouldn't see the bills. Managing the paperwork how? Richard looked at his hands again. I started intercepting mail before you could see it. Bank statements, credit card bills, loan documents. I deal with them myself and only show you the accounts I knew were in good shape. My husband had been filtering our mail for months, maybe years, to hide the evidence of his gambling addiction. I'd been living in a carefully constructed fantasy where our finances looked healthy while Richard managed a secret life of debt and desperation. But that's not the worst part, Richard continued. When the gambling debts got too high and I couldn't make minimum payments anymore, I started using your information to get more credit. My information? Your name, your social security number, your credit score. I opened credit cards in your name and took out a business loan using both our signatures. I felt like I was going to throw up. You stole my identity. I was going to pay everything back. I kept detailed records of every dollar I borrowed using your information. I was treating it like a loan from you that I'd pay back with interest once I got things under control. Richard, that's not how identity theft works. You can't just decide to use someone else's credit because you plan to pay it back eventually. I know that now. But when you're desperate and you've been losing for months, you tell yourself whatever you need to tell yourself to keep going. The gambling addiction had completely rewired Richard's brain. The man who used to lecture me about the importance of maintaining good credit had destroyed both our credit scores to chase losses that kept getting bigger. The insurance fraud was supposed to be the solution. $12,000 would have been enough to make payments on the worst debts and buy me time to figure out a real plan. But you gambled that money away too. Not all at once. I used some of it to pay the most urgent debts, the ones where people were calling and making threats. But then I put the rest into what I thought was a sure bet. Richard had taken money stolen through insurance fraud and immediately put it back into the same online casinos that had destroyed our financial life in the first place. The addiction was so powerful that, even with police investigating him, he couldn't stop gambling. Richard, who was making threats, his face went white. Some of the money I owe isn't to traditional lenders. What does that mean? It means some of these debts are to people who don't go through courts or credit agencies when you don't pay. I felt a chill run down my spine. Are you saying you owe money to dangerous people? I don't know how dangerous they are. But they're not patient, and they're not interested in payment plans. Richard had been gambling with money borrowed from loan sharks, people who collect debts through intimidation and worse. And now, because he'd put our house up as collateral and forged my signature on multiple documents, these people considered me responsible for his debts too. How much do you owe to these non-traditional lenders? About $30,000. $30,000 to people who make threats when you're late with payments. $30,000 that was now my problem too, because Richard had attached my name to his crimes. I sat in our kitchen, looking at my husband of 15 years, and realized I didn't know him at all. The steady, reliable man I'd married was a gambling addict who'd stolen my identity, committed felony fraud, and put our family in danger with loan sharks. But Detective Morrison's words kept echoing in my head. Did you forge your wife's signature on any documents related to this claim? If Richard had forged my signature for insurance fraud, what other documents had my name been forged on? How deep did this identity theft go? The answer was about to destroy whatever remained of my faith in the man I'd trusted with everything. Because when Detective Morrison called an hour later, her first question wasn't about the insurance fraud. It was about the business loan Richard had taken out in my name for a consulting company that didn't exist, and the multiple credit cards he'd opened using my information, and the second mortgage on our house that I'd never signed for. Richard hadn't just hidden a gambling addiction from me. He'd been systematically stealing my identity for months to fund it, and the legal consequences were about to become my problem too. What would you do if you discovered your spouse had not only gambled away your life savings, but had committed identity theft using your information to go even deeper into debt? Because what I was about to learn from Detective Morrison would make everything Richard had confessed look like practice for the real betrayal. My own signature on loans I never signed, credit cards I never opened, medical expenses I never had. Richard had been stealing my identity for months, while everyone praised him for being so financially responsible. Detective Morrison's phone call came while I was still sitting in shock from Richard's confession about owing money to loan sharks. Mrs. Patterson, we need to discuss some additional documents we found during our investigation of your husband's activities. Additional documents? We've uncovered evidence that Mr. Patterson may have committed identity theft on a much larger scale than just the insurance fraud. Can you come down to the station this afternoon? My hands started shaking again. What kind of identity theft? We'll go over everything when you get here. But Mrs. Patterson, I strongly recommend you bring an attorney. An attorney. For the second time in 2 days, a police officer was telling me I needed legal representation because of crimes my husband had committed. I hung up and looked at Richard, who was sitting at our kitchen table with his head in his hands. Richard, what other documents did you forge my signature on? He didn't look up. Michelle, I think you should call a lawyer before we talk about this anymore. I'm not calling a lawyer to talk to my own husband in my own kitchen. What other documents? Richard raised his head, and I saw tears in his eyes. A lot of documents. 2 hours later, I sat across from Detective Morrison in a small, windowless room at the police station. The attorney I'd hastily hired, Janet Rodriguez, sat next to me taking notes while Detective Morrison laid out the scope of Richard's identity theft. Mrs. Patterson, we've identified at least 12 separate instances where your husband forged your signature on financial documents over the past 8 months. 12 instances. My stomach dropped. Can you tell me what kind of documents? Detective Morrison opened a thick folder. 3 credit card applications. 2 personal loans totaling $35,000. A business loan for $40,000 for something called Patterson Family Consulting. A home equity line of credit for $25,000. And a second mortgage on your house for $85,000. I felt like the room was spinning. I never signed any of those things. We know. We've had handwriting experts compare the signatures to samples of your actual signature. Your husband forged your name on documents totaling over $200,000 in debt. Janet, my attorney, leaned forward. Detective, what's my client's legal exposure here? That depends on what we find as we dig deeper. Mrs. Patterson, were you aware that your husband had been telling people you were sick? Sick? What do you mean sick? Detective Morrison pulled out more documents. Your husband borrowed $15,000 from his brother Scott last month. He told Scott that you'd been diagnosed with a serious medical condition and needed expensive treatment not covered by insurance. I stared at the detective. I've never been sick. I haven't even had a cold in 6 months. We know. Scott Patterson provided us with text messages where your husband described your supposed medical treatments and asked for money to help with medical bills. Richard had been lying to his own brother about me being seriously ill to borrow money for gambling. He'd used my health, my reputation, and my family relationships as tools to fund his addiction. There's more. Your husband also borrowed money from your sister Diane, your neighbor Carol Williams, and at least 3 of his accounting clients. In each case, he claimed you were dealing with medical issues and needed financial help. My sister Diane. Richard had borrowed money from my own sister using lies about my health. How was I going to explain this to my family? How much money total? From family and friends? About $25,000. All borrowed using fabricated stories about your medical conditions. Detective Morrison pulled out another stack of papers. Mrs. Patterson, are you familiar with a company called Patterson Family Consulting? No, I've never heard of it. Your husband registered this company using both your names as co-owners. He used this fake business to secure a $40,000 small business loan. According to the loan application, Patterson Family Consulting specializes in marketing and accounting services, with you listed as the marketing director. Richard had created an entire fake business and made me an unwitting partner in it. A business that existed only on paper to help him borrow more money. The loan application includes tax returns for this fake business showing substantial income over the past 2 years. Your husband created completely fraudulent financial records and forged your signature as co-owner to get the loan approved. Janet took detailed notes. Detective, is my client considered a suspect in any of these crimes? Not at this time. Everything we've found indicates Mrs. Patterson was completely unaware of her husband's activities. But she is a victim of identity theft. And unfortunately, she's also legally liable for some of these debts because her name is on the documents. Legally liable. Even though I never signed anything, never knew about any of these loans, and never benefited from a single dollar, I was responsible for paying back money Richard had stolen using my identity. What does that mean for me financially? Detective Morrison looked sympathetic. Mrs. Patterson, your credit has been severely damaged. Your house is currently in foreclosure proceedings because your husband stopped making payments on the second mortgage 3 months ago. And several creditors are pursuing collection actions against both of you jointly. Our house was in foreclosure. The home we'd lived in for 10 years, the home I thought we owned free and clear, was about to be taken by the bank because Richard had secretly mortgaged it and then stopped making payments. Why didn't I receive any foreclosure notices? Your husband has been intercepting your mail for months. We found a box in his office containing unopened foreclosure notices, collection letters, and bank statements going back to last Christmas. Last Christmas. While I was buying presents and making holiday plans, Richard was hiding foreclosure notices and managing a secret financial crisis that was about to destroy our entire life. Janet asked the question I was afraid to hear the answer to. Detective, what's the total debt exposure here? Based on what we've found so far, the Pattersons are liable for approximately $250,000 in various debts. Their total assets, including the house before foreclosure, are worth maybe $100,000. We were financially ruined beyond recovery. Even if we sold everything we owned, we'd still owe more than $100,000 to various creditors. Mrs. Patterson, Detective Morrison continued, we're also investigating your husband's relationship with several online lending companies that appear to be engaged in predatory practices. Some of the people he owes money to are concerning. Concerning how? Let's just say they don't use traditional collection methods. We've had reports of harassment and threats directed at other people who've defaulted on loans with these companies. The loan sharks Richard had borrowed money from were now going to be my problem. People who made threats and used harassment were going to be looking for repayment from me for debts I never knew existed. Detective, what kind of criminal charges is Richard facing? Insurance fraud, identity theft, forgery, and possibly racketeering if we can prove he was working with others to commit these crimes. He's looking at several years in prison. Several years in prison. My husband of 15 years was going to jail, and I was going to be left alone to deal with $250,000 in debt to creditors who included loan sharks. As we left the police station, Janet explained my legal situation. Michelle, you need to file for divorce immediately to protect yourself from further financial damage. You also need to contact every creditor and financial institution to report the identity theft. And you should probably consider bankruptcy to discharge the debts you're not legally responsible for. Divorce. Bankruptcy. Starting over at age 42 with destroyed credit and no savings. The good news is that you're clearly a victim here. The police believe your story about being unaware of Richard's activities. But the bad news is that victims of identity theft still have to spend years cleaning up the financial mess. That evening, I sat in our living room, soon to be the bank's living room, trying to process the scope of Richard's betrayal. He hadn't just hidden a gambling addiction from me. He'd systematically stolen my identity, destroyed my credit, put our home at risk, and borrowed money from our family using lies about my health. He'd created fake businesses, forged legal documents, and put me in debt to dangerous people. The man everyone trusted to manage their finances had been running a criminal enterprise while maintaining the perfect facade of suburban respectability. But the cruelest part was that Richard had destroyed the trust of everyone who cared about us. Our families, our friends, our neighbors, everyone who'd lent him money based on fabricated stories about my medical problems, they were all victims of his lies too. How do you explain to your sister that your husband borrowed money from her by claiming you were dying of cancer? How do you face neighbors who tried to help with medical bills for conditions that never existed? Richard's gambling addiction hadn't just destroyed our marriage and our finances. It had destroyed our entire community of relationships. The next morning, I called my sister Diane. Diane, I need to tell you something about Richard and the money he borrowed from you last month. Oh. How are you feeling, Michelle? Richard said your treatments were going well. I started crying right there on the phone. Diane, I've never been sick. Richard made up everything about me having medical problems. He used that money for gambling debts. The silence on the other end of the line lasted forever. What are you talking about, Michelle? Richard has a gambling addiction. He's been stealing money from everyone by lying about me being sick. He's been arrested for insurance fraud and identity theft. My sister started crying too. Michelle, I gave him $15,000. I took out a loan against my retirement account because I thought you were dying. Richard's lies hadn't just cost us our financial future. They'd cost my sister her retirement savings and destroyed the trust between us that had lasted our entire lives. How many other relationships had Richard poisoned with his lies? How many people were going to look at me and wonder if I'd known what he was doing? The answer was about to get much worse. because when I checked our voice messages that afternoon, there were 12 calls from friends and family members who'd seen Richard's arrest in the local newspaper. Everyone we knew was about to learn that the man they'd trusted with their financial advice and their emergency loans was a criminal who'd been systematically lying to them for months. And I was the wife who should have known what was happening in her own home. What would you do if your spouse's crimes didn't just destroy your marriage and finances, but also poisoned every relationship in your community? Because the social consequences of Richard's betrayal were about to become just as devastating as the financial ones. The man I'd trusted with everything hadn't just stolen from me. He'd stolen from everyone who'd ever trusted either of us, and now I had to live with the aftermath of his crimes for the rest of my life. The neighborhood treasurer, the man who did everyone's taxes, the husband everyone envied me for having. Richard's arrest made the local news, and I became the woman who had to have known. The phone started ringing at 6 a.m. the morning after Richard's story hit the Waterford County Tribune. Our local newspaper had run a front-page article, "Local Accountant Arrested in Insurance Fraud Scheme." The first call was from my neighbor Carol. "Michelle, I just saw the newspaper. Please tell me this isn't true." I was still in my pajamas, holding a cup of coffee with shaking hands. "It's true, Carol. But Richard does our taxes every year. He's been managing our investment accounts for 5 years. He helped us refinance our mortgage. How could he be involved in insurance fraud?" That was the question everyone was going to ask. Richard wasn't just my husband. He was the financial advisor for half our neighborhood. People trusted him with their most important financial decisions. "Carol, I don't know what to tell you. I'm as shocked as you are. Michelle, he borrowed $3,000 from us last month. Said you were having medical issues and needed help with treatment costs." My heart sank. Carol and her husband Jim were retired, living on fixed incomes. $3,000 was probably a significant amount for them. "Carol, I've never been sick. Richard made up the medical problems to borrow money for gambling debts." The silence on the phone lasted forever. Then Carol said something that cut right through me. "How could you not know your own husband was gambling away thousands of dollars?" That question, "How could you not know?" was going to haunt me for years. By noon, I'd received calls from 14 different people. Richard's brother Scott, who'd lent us $15,000. Our next-door neighbors, who'd given Richard $2,000 for my medical treatments. 3 of Richard's accounting clients who'd trusted him with their business finances. My own mother, who'd seen the newspaper online and was crying so hard she could barely speak. Each conversation was the same painful pattern. Shock about Richard's arrest. Confusion about how the responsible husband could be a criminal. And then the realization that they'd been victims of his lies too. But the hardest call was from Janet Morrison, the woman who ran our neighborhood association. "Michelle, I need to ask you some difficult questions." "Okay." "Richard has been the treasurer of the Maple Hill Neighborhood Association for 3 years. He's had access to our community funds, our dues payments, and our emergency reserves. Given what we've learned about his gambling and fraud charges, we need to audit our accounts immediately." I felt sick. Richard had been stealing from our neighbors' monthly association dues to fund his gambling addiction. How much money does the association have in its accounts? There should be about $18,000. But Michelle, I tried to access our bank account this morning, and the balance is showing as $412. Richard had stolen nearly $18,000 from our neighborhood association. Money that was supposed to pay for street maintenance, holiday decorations, and emergency repairs. Money that our neighbors had been contributing for years, trusting Richard to manage it responsibly. Janet, I had no idea. I never knew Richard was taking money from the association. I believe you, Michelle. But the other board members are meeting tonight to decide whether to file criminal charges against Richard for embezzlement. And unfortunately, we're going to have to assess special fees to all the homeowners to replace the stolen money. Our neighbors were going to have to pay extra fees because my husband had stolen their community funds. People who'd already been victimized by Richard's fake medical emergency loans were going to be charged again to replace the money he'd embezzled. The social consequences were becoming as devastating as the financial ones. I couldn't go to the grocery store without people staring and whispering. I couldn't check my mail without neighbors avoiding eye contact. But the worst part was the doubt I saw in everyone's eyes. The unspoken question, did she really not know? 3 days after the newspaper article, I received a visit from Detective Morrison. "Mrs. Patterson, I need to update you on some developments in the case." "More developments?" "We've been investigating Richard's client relationships, and we've found evidence of additional financial crimes." I sat down heavily in our kitchen chair. "What kind of additional crimes?" "Your husband has been embezzling money from several of his accounting clients. Small amounts at first, maybe a few $100s here and there from business accounts he managed. But over the past 6 months, the amounts got larger. Richard had been stealing from the people who paid him to protect their money. Business owners who trusted him with their payroll accounts, their tax payments, their profit distributions." "How much money?" "About $45,000 from 6 different clients. We think he was using client funds to make payments on his gambling debts and then covering the shortfalls by moving money between accounts. $45,000 stolen from small business owners who'd hired Richard because they trusted his reputation for honesty and competence. Mrs. Patterson, all of these clients are going to suffer significant financial hardship because of your husband's theft. Some of them may have to close their businesses. Richard's crimes weren't just destroying our family. They were destroying the livelihoods of people who'd done nothing wrong except trust the wrong accountant. There's something else. We've discovered that Richard was working with 2 other individuals to commit some of these frauds. This wasn't just an addiction problem, it was an organized criminal enterprise. Other people were involved. Brandon Webb, the contractor, and a man named Tony Russo, who appears to have been providing Richard with loans and gambling credit in exchange for access to client information. Tony Russo. The name from those threatening emails I'd found. Richard hadn't just been gambling online. He'd been working with criminals who used his access to client accounts as collateral for gambling debts. Mrs. Patterson, this means Richard's charges are going to be upgraded to racketeering and conspiracy. He's looking at 10 to 15 years in prison instead of the 2 to 3 years we originally estimated. 10 to 15 years. My husband was going to be in prison until he was nearly 60 years old. What does this mean for me? The good news is that the evidence clearly shows you weren't involved in any of these crimes. The bad news is that the civil liability is going to be much worse than we initially thought. Detective Morrison pulled out another folder. Richard's victims are preparing a class action lawsuit against both of you jointly. They're seeking damages for the money he stole, plus punitive damages, plus legal fees. You're looking at potential civil judgments of over $500,000. $500,000 in civil judgments, on top of the $250,000 in debt Richard had already accumulated. Even if I declared bankruptcy, some of these judgments might not be dischargeable. Mrs. Patterson, I have to ask, are you planning to stay in Waterford? I looked around our kitchen, the heart of the home where I'd thought I was building a stable, happy life with a trustworthy partner. I don't think I can. Everyone here sees me as either a victim to be pitted or a criminal who got away with it. My neighbors lost money because they trusted my husband. The people at the grocery store whisper when they see me. My own mother asked me if I was really that naive about Richard's activities. The community I'd lived in for 10 years no longer felt like home. Every relationship had been poisoned by Richard's crimes. Every conversation was awkward because people didn't know how to treat me. That evening, I walked through our house one last time before the foreclosure proceedings began. Every room held memories of 15 years of marriage, but now those memories felt contaminated by the knowledge of what Richard had really been doing while I was working and traveling. The bedroom where workers had installed beautiful hardwood floors using money stolen through insurance fraud. The kitchen where Richard had sat across from me every morning, asking about my work schedule so he could plan his criminal activities around my travel. The living room where we'd hosted neighbors and friends, many of whom were now Richard's victims. The home office where Richard had forged my signature on hundreds of documents while maintaining detailed spreadsheets of his lies. I'd lost more than my marriage and my financial security. I'd lost my sense of home, my community relationships, and my faith in my own judgment. How do you start over at 42 when everyone you know thinks you either knew about your spouse's crimes or were too naive to notice obvious warning signs? The answer was, you leave everything behind and start completely fresh somewhere else. 3 weeks later, I signed the divorce papers and the foreclosure documents on the same day. Richard pled guilty to all charges and was sentenced to 12 years in prison with restitution requirements that would follow him for the rest of his life. I moved to a small apartment in a city 2 hours away where no one knew my story and I could rebuild my life without the constant weight of being the wife of that criminal accountant. But even now, 3 years later, I still get friend requests on social media from people who recognize my name from the newspaper articles. I still have to explain to new employers why there's a gap in my employment history and why my credit was destroyed in 2019. Richard's crimes didn't just steal my money and break my heart. They stole my identity, my community, and my ability to trust my own instincts about the people closest to me. The hardest part isn't the financial recovery. It's learning to believe in myself again after being so completely deceived by someone I trusted with everything. What would you do if your spouse's criminal activities didn't just destroy your marriage, but also made you an outcast in your own community? How do you rebuild trust when everyone questions how you could have been so blind to what was happening in your own home? Because the shame of being Richard's victim was almost worse than the crimes themselves. And that shame was something I was going to have to carry with me no matter where I went or how I tried to start over. I moved into a cramped apartment with nothing but legal debt and a destroyed credit score, learning to trust my own judgment again after being fooled for 15 years by the person I trusted most. The apartment I could afford was a 600 square foot studio above a bakery in Hartford, Connecticut. 42 years old, and I was starting over with less than what most college graduates have after graduation. My entire life fit into my Honda Civic. 3 suitcases of clothes, a box of legal documents, my laptop, and about $1,200 in cash, everything that remained after lawyers, moving expenses, and the security deposit on my new place. The first night in that studio apartment, I sat on an air mattress I'd bought at Walmart and cried harder than I had since my father died. Not just for Richard or our marriage, but for the version of myself who'd believed she was living a stable, secure life with a trustworthy partner. That woman was gone forever. She'd been replaced by someone who questioned every interaction, who checked and double-checked every financial document, who couldn't sleep without making sure the door was locked 3 times. But I had to survive. And surviving meant working. I'd managed to keep most of my marketing clients during the chaos of Richard's arrest and our divorce. Working from coffee shops and the public library, I slowly rebuilt my freelance business while living on ramen noodles and generic cereal. The hardest part wasn't the financial struggle. It was learning to make decisions again. For 15 years, I'd shared every major choice with Richard. Where to live, how to spend money, what cars to buy, when to take vacations. Now I was paralyzed by simple decisions like which apartment to rent or whether I could afford a $15 meal at a restaurant. If I'd been so wrong about Richard, the person I knew better than anyone else in the world, how could I trust myself to make good choices about anything? 6 months into my new life, I was working 16-hour days and sleeping 4 hours a night. Not because I had to, but because staying busy was the only way to avoid thinking about how completely my life had imploded. My therapist, Dr. Sarah Chin, finally called me out on it. Michelle, you're punishing yourself for Richard's crimes. I'm working hard to rebuild my life. You're working obsessively to avoid processing what happened to you. When's the last time you took a day off? I couldn't remember. I don't have time for days off. I have legal fees to pay and debt to manage, and you have trauma to heal from. You are the victim of a decade-long campaign of deception and financial abuse. That's not something you can just power through with 18-hour workdays. Dr. Chin was right, but accepting help felt impossible. Richard had been so good at appearing helpful while secretly destroying everything. How could I trust another person's guidance? Michelle, what are you most afraid of? Making another huge mistake. Trusting the wrong person again. Ending up back where I started. So you're going to control every detail of your life to make sure that never happens? If that's what it takes. What if I told you that trying to control everything is actually making you more vulnerable, not less? That session was the beginning of understanding how Richard's betrayal had damaged more than my finances. It had damaged my ability to connect with other people, to take reasonable risks, to believe in my own judgment. Slowly, very slowly, I started making small changes. I joined a support group for victims of financial abuse. Listening to other people's stories helped me realize that what happened to me wasn't unique or a reflection of my intelligence or character. Sarah, whose husband had hidden a cocaine addiction and stolen $300,000 from their joint accounts. Mark, whose wife had been running credit card scams for 3 years while he thought she was starting a legitimate consulting business. Jennifer, whose partner had been embezzling from the nonprofit where they both worked, destroying Jennifer's reputation in their field. All of us were smart, successful people who'd been systematically deceived by someone we loved and trusted. All of us struggled with shame about not knowing what was happening in our own lives. The hardest part, Sarah told the group one evening, is that people expect you to be angry. They want you to talk about how much you hate your ex-husband. But I'm not angry, I'm heartbroken. I loved him. I built a life with him. And now I have to grieve that entire relationship while also dealing with the practical consequences of his crimes. That's exactly how I felt. I wasn't angry at Richard. I was devastated by the loss of what I thought we had together. After a year in Hartford, I was finally stable enough to start thinking about the future instead of just surviving each day. My business was growing, I'd paid off most of the legal fees, and I was sleeping through the night more often than not. But I was also lonely. Profoundly, achingly lonely. I hadn't been on a date since before I married Richard. I hadn't even considered the possibility of trusting someone enough to build a new relationship. My first attempt at dating was a disaster. Coffee with a perfectly nice man named David who worked in software development. When he mentioned that he managed his own investment portfolio, I excused myself to go to the bathroom and had a panic attack. Investment portfolios. Financial management. The words that had once meant security now triggered immediate anxiety about hidden debts and secret accounts. Take it slow, Dr. Chin advised. Dating doesn't have to mean sharing finances or making major life decisions together. It can just mean enjoying someone's company. But how do you enjoy someone's company when you're constantly watching for signs of deception? When you're analyzing every story they tell for inconsistencies? When you're Googling their name and checking public records before the second date? The hypervigilance that had developed as a survival mechanism was making it impossible to connect authentically with anyone. 2 years after leaving Waterford, I met James. He was a teacher at the community college where I was taking a pottery class, my therapist's suggestion for finding activities that had nothing to do with work or money. James taught literature and had been divorced for 5 years after his wife left him for her personal trainer. Our first conversation was about books. Nothing threatening, nothing related to finances or major life decisions. Just a discussion about whether the ending of The Great Gatsby was hopeful or tragic. I think it's both, James said. Gatsby's dream was built on lies, but the capacity to dream and hope, that's what makes us human. Something about that conversation felt safe. James wasn't trying to impress me with talk about his investments or his business success. He wasn't asking personal questions or pushing for more information than I was ready to share. We had coffee after pottery class for 6 weeks before I told him my real last name. It took another month before I mentioned that I'd been married before. And it was almost 6 months before I could bring myself to tell him about Richard. I was married to someone who wasn't who I thought he was, I said carefully, watching James's face for judgment or pity. That must have been incredibly difficult. It was. It still is, sometimes. I have a hard time trusting my own judgment about people. James was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Can I tell you something?" After my divorce, I was convinced I was a terrible judge of character. How could someone I'd been married to for 8 years suddenly decide I was completely wrong for her? Maybe I'd been deluding myself about our entire relationship. How did you get past that? I realized that people change, and sometimes they hide things, and that doesn't necessarily mean I was stupid or blind. It might just mean I was loving someone who wasn't capable of being honest about who they were becoming. That conversation was the first time I'd considered that Richard's deception might not be entirely a reflection of my failures as a wife or a human being. James and I took things incredibly slowly. We'd been dating for over a year before I felt comfortable enough to let him see my apartment. Another 6 months before I could talk about money or financial planning without feeling anxious. But gradually, I started to trust my instincts again. Not blindly, the way I had with Richard, but carefully, with appropriate boundaries and honest communication. James knew about my destroyed credit before we moved in together. He knew about the legal judgments and the ongoing restitution payments that would be part of my life for years to come. He knew that I kept separate bank accounts and would probably never feel comfortable with joint finances again. And he was okay with all of that. Not because he pitied me or wanted to rescue me, but because he understood that trust has to be earned over time through consistent actions, not just promised with words. 3 years after moving to Hartford, I had a life I could be proud of again. A successful business, a relationship built on honesty and respect, and most importantly, confidence in my ability to recognize red flags and protect myself. I still had anxiety sometimes. I still checked our finances obsessively and asked too many questions when James made major purchases. I still had nightmares about discovering secret debts or hidden accounts. But I also had something I'd never expected to feel again, hope for the future. The woman who'd lived in that beautiful house in Waterford with the fraudulent floors and the lying husband was gone. But the woman who'd survived Richard's betrayal, rebuilt her career from nothing, and learned to trust carefully but genuinely, that woman was stronger than she'd ever imagined she could be. What would you do if you had to start over completely at middle age, with no savings and damaged credit? How long do you think it would take you to trust someone enough to build a new relationship? Because what I learned during those years of rebuilding was that surviving betrayal isn't just about recovering financially. It's about recovering your faith in yourself, your ability to make good choices, and your capacity to love someone new without letting fear control every interaction. The hardest lesson was also the most important one. Richard's crimes were about Richard, not about me. I wasn't stupid for trusting him. I wasn't naive for believing his lies. I was a normal person in love with someone who turned out to be living a secret life. And recognizing that difference between being a victim and being responsible for someone else's criminal behavior was what finally allowed me to stop punishing myself for Richard's choices. But the most important lesson was still ahead of me, because everything I'd learned about trust, boundaries, and starting over was about to be tested in a way I never expected. That fraudulent bedroom floor was gorgeous when finished, just like everything else in my marriage that looked perfect on the surface, but was built on deception, debt, and desperation. 5 years after Richard's arrest, I received a phone call that brought everything full circle. "Michelle, this is Detective Morrison. I have some news about Richard that I thought you should hear." My heart started racing. Even years later, hearing Richard's name in connection with law enforcement triggered immediate anxiety. "Is everything okay?" Richard was found dead in his prison cell yesterday morning. It appears to be suicide. I sat down heavily in my Hartford apartment kitchen. Richard was dead. The man who'd shared my bed for 15 years, who I'd loved and trusted and built a life with, had killed himself in prison. The prison chaplain said Richard had been struggling with depression and guilt about what he'd done to you and his victims. He wanted me to give you this letter. A letter. From beyond the grave, Richard was trying to communicate with me one last time. I drove to the police station in a daze. Detective Morrison handed me a manila envelope with my name written in Richard's careful handwriting, the same handwriting that had forged my signature on hundreds of fraudulent documents. I waited until I got home to open it. Michelle, the letter began, I know you have no reason to believe anything I tell you now, but I need you to know that everything good about our marriage was real. My love for you is real. My pride in your success was real. The happiness we shared in the early years, that was all genuine. What wasn't real was my ability to handle failure and disappointment like an adult instead of trying to gamble my way out of problems. I started gambling because I was ashamed of struggling professionally while you were thriving in your career. Instead of talking to you about feeling inadequate, I tried to solve the problem by winning money. That decision destroyed everything good in both our lives. I want you to know that none of what happened was your fault. You weren't naive or stupid for trusting me. I worked very hard to hide my addiction and my crimes because I knew they were wrong. You believed me because I was deliberately deceiving you, not because you were failing as a wife. I also want you to know that I understand why you divorced me and moved away. I destroyed your ability to trust, your financial security, your reputation in our community, and your relationships with friends and family. There's no apology that can repair that kind of damage. But Michelle, please don't let what I did prevent you from trusting other people or building a new life. You deserve to be happy. You deserve to be loved honestly by someone who won't betray your trust. The insurance money, the $12,000 from the fraudulent claim, I kept detailed records of how it was spent. Most of it went to pay gambling debts, but $3,200 went to Tony Russo and his associates to buy more time before they started threatening you directly. I was trying to protect you from the consequences of my addiction, even while I was making those consequences worse. I know that doesn't excuse anything I did. But I wanted you to know that even in my worst moments, I was trying to keep you safe from the people I'd gotten involved with. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking you to forgive yourself for trusting someone who didn't deserve it and to trust yourself to recognize genuinely good people who do deserve it. The bedroom floor in our old house really was beautiful when it was finished. Sometimes I wonder if the current owners know it was installed with stolen money, or if they just enjoy having beautiful floors without thinking about where they came from. I hope you can build something beautiful and honest in your new life, something that isn't based on lies and fraud and desperation. Love always, Richard. P.S. I kept a detailed spreadsheet of every dollar I stole using your identity. It's in my prison belongings. Detective Morrison can help you get it for the civil lawsuit proceedings. I read the letter 3 times, crying harder each time. Richard's suicide didn't change anything about what he'd done to me or our victims. But it did give me something I didn't know I needed, confirmation that the early years of our marriage had been real, and that his crimes were about his own failures, not mine. The funeral was small, just Richard's brother Scott, his elderly parents, and me. Most of his victims had moved on with their lives and wanted nothing to do with mourning the man who'd betrayed them. Standing at Richard's graveside, I felt an unexpected sense of closure. Not forgiveness. I wasn't ready for that yet, but understanding. Richard had been a man with serious mental health problems who'd made terrible choices rather than seek help. His gambling addiction had been a symptom of deeper issues with shame, inadequacy, and fear of disappointing others. That didn't excuse his crimes, but it helped me understand how someone I'd loved could have become someone I didn't recognize. After the funeral, I had dinner with Scott and Richard's parents. They were devastated, not just by Richard's death, but by the knowledge that they'd completely misunderstood who he'd become in his final years. We had no idea, Richard's mother said. He always seemed so responsible, so reliable. When he asked to borrow money for your medical expenses, we never questioned it because Richard had never lied to us before. None of us knew, I told her. Richard was very good at hiding his problems and making everything look normal from the outside. 6 months after Richard's death, I received a check from his estate. The detailed spreadsheet he'd mentioned in his letter had helped my attorney recover some of the money he'd stolen using my identity. It wasn't much, about $8,000 after legal fees, but it was something. More importantly, the civil lawsuit against Richard's estate provided closure for many of his victims. People like Carol and Jim, who'd lost their retirement savings trying to help with my fake medical bills. Small business owners who'd nearly gone bankrupt because Richard embezzled from their accounts. The settlement payments wouldn't make anyone whole, but they provided some financial relief and, more importantly, acknowledgement that what had happened to all of us was serious and wrong. 7 years after Richard's arrest, James and I got married in a small ceremony in Dr. Chen's backyard. No big reception, no expensive flowers, no joint bank accounts, just a commitment to love each other honestly and build something real together. At our reception, Dr. Chen made a toast that brought me to tears. Michelle has shown all of us that it's possible to survive betrayal and still believe in love. Not naive trust, but mature love that includes appropriate boundaries, honest communication, and the wisdom to recognize red flags before they become disasters. James and I have been married for 3 years now. We keep separate finances, we share household expenses equally, and we have weekly check-ins about money, feelings, and anything that's concerning either of us. It's not the fairy tale marriage I thought I had with Richard. It's better. It's based on reality, mutual respect, and the kind of transparency that makes genuine intimacy possible. I still work as a marketing consultant, but I've also started speaking to women's groups about financial abuse and the warning signs of hidden addictions in relationships. Not because I want to relive my trauma, but because I want other women to recognize red flags that I missed. The signs I should have noticed: Richard's increasing anxiety when I came home unexpectedly. His insistence on handling all our finances alone. The way he discouraged me from opening our mail or checking our bank statements. His defensive reactions when I asked questions about our money. Most importantly, I want women to understand that financial abusers often target successful, intelligent people specifically because we're less likely to be suspected of being victims. Richard didn't choose me because I was weak or naive. He chose me because I was financially stable and trusting, which made me a good target for exploitation. My story isn't unique. Financial abuse affects millions of people, usually committed by partners, family members, or trusted friends. The shame and self-blame that victims feel is part of what allows the abuse to continue. But here's what I want you to remember from my story. Being betrayed by someone you trust doesn't make you stupid. It makes you human. Trusting people is a normal, healthy behavior that allows us to build relationships and communities. The problem isn't that I trusted Richard. The problem is that Richard chose to abuse that trust for his own selfish purposes. I've learned to trust again, but differently. I trust people who earn it over time through consistent actions. I verify important information instead of just accepting what I'm told. I maintain financial independence and insist on transparency in all my important relationships. Most importantly, I've learned to trust myself. My instincts, my observations, my right to ask questions and expect honest answers. The beautiful hardwood floor that started this whole story is probably still there in our old house in Waterford. Maybe the current owners refinished it and it looks even better now. Maybe they have no idea it was installed with money stolen through insurance fraud. But I know the truth about that floor, just like I know the truth about everything else in my marriage to Richard. It looked perfect on the surface, but it was built on lies, paid for with stolen money, and installed by criminals. The life I'm building now with James might not look as perfect from the outside. We live in a modest apartment, we budget carefully, and we don't have expensive furniture or luxury vacations. But everything we have is honest. Our love is based on truth, our finances are transparent, and our future is built on a foundation of mutual respect rather than deception and fraud. That's worth more than all the beautiful floors money can buy. What would you do if you came home to find workers in your bedroom? I hope you'd ask more questions than I did. I hope you'd trust your instincts if something felt wrong. I hope you'd demand transparency from the people you love. But if you find yourself in a situation like mine, betrayed by someone you trusted, financially devastated by someone else's crimes, questioning every relationship and every decision, please remember this. You can survive it. You can rebuild. You can love again. And you can trust again with wisdom instead of naivety. The bedroom floor in my old house was gorgeous, but it was built on lies. The life I'm building now might be simpler, but it's built on truth. And that makes all the difference in the world.